make disciples or waste money. American churches spend a lot of money propping up church programs, funding short-term missions, and supporting traditional missionaries overseas. These are all the things that we've always spent money on. But look at this. This is really scary when you hear this number. You won't even believe me at first. In the United States, we spend approximately $1.5 million for every baptism. Huh? One person. Now, listen. Now, I told you wouldn't believe me. How much does it cost to baptize somebody? Nothing. Unless you add up these numbers. The cost of all the pastors' salaries, the cost of all the students paying money to go to seminaries, the cost of all the buildings that we rent or are purchasing, the cost of all the water fountains on the church properties. There's a church that I know in California that they have a river running through their property. It's all man-made. It's concrete. It's a river. It's got a lake in it. The lake is where they baptize people. It's got a fountain in it. They're spending over $10,000 a month running that stupid fountain and river. When you take all that money that it takes to run church in America and you add it all up and then you divide it by the number of people that got baptized in churches in America, it comes down to $1.5 million per baptism. And that's hard data. I've got the research for it. That's not just me making this up. That's hard data. And then, if you look at the mission field, it's a lot better. It only costs $753,000 to baptize somebody in Africa or China. Because here's what that adds up. That adds up all the costs of missionaries going to seminary, all the costs of flying missionaries there, making sure they got health insurance, making sure that they live in nicer houses than the local people do, building church buildings, all the things that we do in the name of Jesus, and then you divide it by the number of people that are being baptized, and it costs $753,000 per year per baptism. I think we've come a long, long, long ways from somebody standing on a mountaintop and saying, go out and make disciples of all the nations, teaching them to obey all that I've commanded you. I think we've come a long, 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 long ways from John the Baptist dunking people in the river and calling them a bunch of snakes who need to get their life together. I think we've come a long ways from the kind of churches that I read about in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 2, where they got together for teaching, for fellowship, for breaking of bread, for prayer. You don't break bread in large churches. The church that I've been going to in California, every week when I go there, I get told 3 times, welcome to, I don't name the church, but welcome to our church. Somebody is standing outside at the edge of the parking lot. I usually park in the street. I walk into the parking lot, and there's a person there that says, smiles at me and says, welcome to our church. And then I go to the door. There's another person, and they say exactly the same thing, welcome to our church. And they don't talk to me. They just say, welcome to our church. And then I go inside, and I'm going into the auditorium, and they hand me a bulletin with an offering envelope in it, and they say, welcome to our church. And I go sit down, and first week I went there, I think, these people don't like me. They don't even talk to me. You know, welcome to our church. What's that mean? That's shallow. They don't even like me. And then I went back the next week, and the same darn thing happened, and now I'm madder. And then I leave, and nobody says anything to me as I'm leaving. Not a word. They don't even say goodbye from our church. They don't say anything. Well, then, the third week, I start really noticing, looking around. Nobody's talking to anybody. You might see 5 or 6 we're talking 1,000 people. You might see 5 or 6 conversations. Everybody is moving out the door or moving in the door. Nobody's standing around talking to anybody. It's a poorly attended Christian rock concert. There's no fellowship. There's no love. There's no food. Oh yeah, there's food. You can go across the parking lot and they made a little coffee shop. You can go over there and buy coffee. Got 1,000 people. You couldn't fit 20 people in that coffee shop. There's no fellowship. Apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, prayer, praise and worship, generously giving to each other, meeting in each other's homes on a daily basis. That's church. And none of it costs any money at all. And here we've made this big, expensive, horribly, almost useless thing that we call church. It's just a big spectator show. And it's not working out really well. And here's the sad thing. There's a lot of those kind of churches that are way better than the one I've been going to. There's a lot of those churches that they do reach out and they do talk to you when you're coming in, but you kind of get processed through. It's still just a big show. It still really never gets down to people sharing life with each other. This is the state of the church in America. Now, are all churches in America bad? No, not by any stretch. But we are so far away from what we read about in the book of Acts. We're so far away. And you know what? And this is what I'm trying to say to you guys. You guys are far closer to the book of Acts than the churches I've been going to in America. Far, far closer. You're far closer. We tried when I pastored really hard. We built our churches around these scriptures. Go and make disciples. Teach them. Take the ones that I've taught you, what I taught you, teach it somebody, teach somebody, teach somebody. That the leaders of the church, Ephesians chapter 4, exists to equip the saints to do the work of the ministry. And the fourth was Acts chapter 2, verses 41 to 47. We're not going to do anything if we don't find it in Acts chapter 2, 41 to 47. And yet still, as we got large, we became a spectator operation. And I want us to not be a spectator. We're supposed to be a family. We're supposed to be a family. And your churches are doing a lot better job of family than the churches are in America. So, but here's the one thing that I got to say to you. And I think you're doing a good job at this. I just got to say you could do a better job. Is that he told me day before yesterday that you had a slow year, you only planted 3 churches. Well, if I was in most countries of the world and they said they planted 3 churches, they'd be rejoicing. But if a slow year is 3 churches, then you ought to be planting 9 churches a year. And I think the way to do it is this microchurch idea. It works. And how I know it really works is, I was just with his pastor in Sri Lanka. They have planted 20,000 churches in 35 years. Excuse me, is that right? 2,000 churches. 2,000 churches, 35 years. Started with 28 people. 2,000 churches. There are 18,000 people going to those churches. That's a lot of people. That's more people than are going to your churches. But divide 18,000 by 2,000, and you get an average church size of 9 people. Their house church movement. Now, the big church now has over 2,000 people attending. 2,100 people attend the big church. There are several churches that got 300 or 400 people. That will happen. Your church, some of you guys that are at 100, in a year from now will be at 150. That'll happen. That's fine. We want that to happen. But that means that there's a lot of churches of 6 and 7 people meeting in houses. I was with a pastor who pastors, he attends church on Sunday morning, the big church. He pastors 2 other churches, one at 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, one at 7 o'clock. He says, I go into neighborhoods that are so dangerous I wouldn't take my children there. But I pastor churches there. Some of these churches have 4 people. Some of these churches are so poor, they're not going to come to your church. One of my best friends right now is living in Omaha, Nebraska. We were talking on a Zoom conversation, and he gets a phone call in the middle of the conversation, and he finds out that his babysitter has his 4 children in the car, and they stopped at a stoplight, and a car next to them blew up. It was a car bomb. A drug deal had gone bad, and they murdered somebody in that car. And he was so thankful his children weren't hurt. His car wasn't even hurt, but this car blew up. And then he tells me afterwards, well, that's my neighborhood. And then he said this, that's why you can't come to my neighborhood. He's in an African-American community that's very violent. And I'm too white to be allowed to come to his neighborhood. And this guy's getting the job done. This guy is seriously getting the job. They're planting churches. They're taking guys coming out of jail. He created a roofing company. And a year ago, he started a roofing business. And I go, how many people work for you? And I think he's going to, a 1-year-old company. I think he's going to say like 6 or 7. He goes, 40, 51. You have 51 people working for him. And then he says this, I only hire guys coming out of prison. I'm telling you this, the people that he's hiring, that are getting saved, that are going to his church, that he's turning some of them into pastors, would never, ever feel comfortable in the church I pastored. Never. And some of them don't feel comfortable in my friend Myron's church. It's a mostly black church with a few white people coming to it, but it's middle class in a poor black neighborhood. And you got these guys coming out of jail, and they've done hard drugs, and and my friend Myron, he did time in jail for shooting people with guns. But he's pastoring this very successful church, and some of these people aren't going to want to come to his church because it's too uppity for them. Because they're street people. So what's he doing? He's sending people to them. And that's how we're going to win the world. So what my challenge to you is, keep doing what you're doing, but you got to multiply it. You got to multiply it. And that's the answer. The answer isn't getting bigger. It's getting more of them. So, moving right along here. Assumption, church income is falling. Now, I don't know if this is true where you live. It's true in America. So, here's what we know. 69% of all charitable donations come from people currently above the age of 50. 69% of all the money coming to church come from people who are more than 50 years old. But when I was 25 years old, I tithed. People of my age when we were 25 years old and we were Christians, we tithed. Today, 25-year-olds don't tithe. 35-year-olds don't tithe. People who are born after 1963 tend to tithe less than people who are born after before 1963. The world changed. The death of John Kennedy and a bunch of things changed America, and there's a strong dividing line. And so these people, who are growing up, so here's what this means, is that over the next 3 decades, next 30 years, as people my age die off, I can make you a promise. 30 years from now, I will be dead. I faithfully tithe. 30 years from now, I won't be tithing. 30 years from now, the church won't have my income. And it may not have the income of my children or grandchildren, even if they're Christians, because younger people aren't tithing. And so they're telling us that beginning in about 15 years from now, these are real fresh numbers, that some of the churches that you know of in America that you see as famous churches, they won't be able to afford their own property. In fact, We know some big churches right now that already have, the building still stands, but they've walled off part of the building and they don't use it anymore because they can't afford to heat the thing, or they can't afford the air conditioning, and so they've shrunk within their building. We're headed for trouble in America in terms of finances. And so change is going to come, is really what I'm saying. Whether we like it or not, change is going to come. Assumption: we spend too much money on the way that we do church. Educational costs: seminary can cost $100,000 US. I see guys that are graduating from seminary and they've had to borrow money to go to school, and they're going to owe money for the rest of their lives. And sadly, going to seminary doesn't make you into a pastor, because going to seminary doesn't make you into a leader. One of the problems that I have, and I've graduated from 2 seminaries, and I'm happy that I did. But here's the false promise that seminary makes, is if you come here and you study hard and you pay us money, at the end of it, when we graduate you and we give you a piece of paper, you will now be a leader. And you cannot make that promise. The only people that are leaders in any room are the people who have followers. If you don't have a follower, you are not a leader. If you have a follower, you are a leader. You may be a rebellious leader, you may be a heretic, you may be a bad leader, but you're a leader. And so think about this with me. I meet people who are bad leaders or rebellious leaders, and I want to go have a real serious talk with them because I want them on my team. I want to change them. And so I'll go and confront them and go, you know what you're doing is absolutely, you can't even stay in our church if you keep doing this. But here's the deal. I think God called you to us, and I can't accomplish what He called me to do if I don't have you on my team. I need you to change. And I watch those guys change. And we disciple them, and we make pastors from within our church. I went to Bible school, and here's the numbers that you get from seminary. Of all the people who come to a class to go to school, compared to those who 2 years after that class graduates are doing the ministry, 95% of those who started fail. They fall aside. When I went to Life Bible College, almost 150 people came to school with me my first year. 2 years after we graduated, there were 14 of us that were left. I have 150. Now there's about 7 or 8 of us that are left. It's two. Okay, so the 50th year since our class graduated, we started with 150 people. 2 of them just got their pin for being 50 years in the ministry. My wife and I weren't there and didn't get a pin, so that would make 4. I have 154 people are left behind. Seminary makes a promise that it cannot keep, and that promise is that, and I think we need seminaries. Seminaries keep us online doctrinally. They do wonderful things for us, but what they don't do is automatically make pastors. Now here's what happens. You start in a church, you give somebody responsibility. I want you to look after these people. Pretty soon he's pastoring 4 or 5 people. And you figure out he's pretty good at pastoring. I can give him a little bit more responsibility. To whom much is given, much will be required. But to whom some is given, more will be given. Well done, good and faithful servant. The church is the pastor factory. The seminary is not the pastor factory. And so the way that we do church in America, people go and not only do they spend $100,000 going to seminary, they might waste $100,000 going to seminary. Here's how I look at it. I went to a Bible college. All these other students went there and they paid money to go to the school, which kept the lights running, kept the doors open, and kept the teachers in a salary. They sacrificed the best earned educational years of their life so I could get a degree and I could stay in the ministry and they could go work at the post office. They could have gone and become a lawyer. They could have gone and become an engineer. They could have gone and become a banker. They could have done a lot of things, but they instead they got a Bible college education, and when they graduated and found out they weren't a pastor, now they sell used cars or they sell life insurance. And that's really the way it is. And so I think I'm not against seminary by any stretch, but I am for you guys training people to be pastors in your churches. And as best you can, don't pull them out of their job. Let them keep their job and teach them to delegate, because we could start a lot more churches for a lot less money if we would do that. Okay, vocational costs. A full-time salary is expensive and not a necessity. This whole idea of I'm going to be a pastor, I mean, here's kind of the typical thing in America. I graduate from seminary, now they owe me a building to preach in and a full-time salary, and I get out and I find out that really I'm only capable of leading a church of about 30 people, and they can't afford a full-time pastor. And so then I have to go and get a job, and in the past it's been go get a job driving a school bus or something like that. Nowadays, a lot of pastors drive Uber. And all their friends who are pastoring 300 or 400 people look at them and go, that guy's a loser. He went to seminary and he can't even earn enough money to pastor a church. He has to go drive a stinking taxi cab. That's the way they look at them. I look at them differently. I look at them and say, that guy's a hero. He's out driving Uber, working 40 hours a week, 45 hours a week driving Uber to give himself the privilege of pastoring those 30 people. That's a hero to me. That's not a loser. The loser's the other guy that sits and looks down his nose at him. That guy's a hero. And so, but I would rather he didn't drive Uber. I'd rather he was a school teacher or a lawyer or a doctor or an engineer. I'd rather he spent his education years doing that and that his church trained him to be a pastor. You know that boy Michael I told you about last night? The one that the pastor beat down and the other pastor lifted up? Part of my discussion with Michael when I saw him in Japan, he's about to graduate with a business degree from the University of Hawaii. I've known him for 9 years. And there are several of us who've known him, and we coached him, and we told him, you want to be a pastor, you're kind of a quiet kid. It turns out he can preach. He lights up when he preaches. But we're afraid that, what if he goes to Bible school and then he ends up being poor and pastoring 30 people all the rest of his life? We don't want to be responsible for that. We're discipling him, so we told him, you go get a master's degree in business administration so you can get a real job, and then you start a church on the side. And if you do well enough at it that you can go to Japan and do it, well, that's all the better, because that's what he wants to do. And so when I just saw him in Japan, he told me he's graduating from the University of Hawaii this December, and he's going to go get a job in business. And I go, oh, that's not the thing you agreed to. You go back to school and get an MBA. Well, why should I do that? Because you get a better job, they'll pay you more money. Well, I'm driving Uber and going to school and trying to work with kids now because this guy John's got me working with kids. I go, Uber is the perfect job. I'd rather you're driving Uber when you're 23 years old than you're driving Uber when you're 45 years old and pastoring a small church. Am I making sense? And so but here was the promise that was made to him years ago when he had a different pastor in a church he was attending. Your pastor will train you to be a pastor. You don't have to go to seminary. You go to business school and learn how to make money, and the church will train you how to be a pastor. And they've actually done a very good job of that. It's just that the new pastor was a diminisher. The old pastor was a multiplier and built into him. And now that he's at a different church, he's back with another multiplier. He's going places. But we're looking for a thing, and you can do this. Building costs. One of the things that's expensive about church is that we always expect for a church to own a building or rent a building. When you start micro churches, you start them in restaurants, or you start them in houses, or you start them in apartments. It doesn't cost you anything. If it grows and you got some money, then go spend some money. But when you're poor and you don't have money, don't spend money. It's better to do it in a house. And it's more fun anyway. Assumption, church planting currently costs too much. You won't even believe this when I tell you this. Okay, the norm in America is 3 years of full-time salary and insurance, medical insurance for the pastor, plus a generous budget to underwrite operations. How many of you, when you started your church, did the Foursquare Church give you 3-year salary guaranteed? And pay your medical insurance, and pay for all the advertising that you needed to start the church? How many of you had that happen to you? Well, wait. Let's look at him. Let's look at him. He came here to work on computers. And he started a micro church. And now all you guys are doing what you're doing. When I used to pray for the Foursquare Church in England, it was a losing proposition. I mean, years and years, they kept sending Americans to England to try to straighten things out in England and get something going in England. And I knew a bunch of them, and it was a mess. And they spent thousands of dollars. I know one guy, they were paying him $200,000 a year to come over here and be a missionary and not pastor a church, to oversee what he's doing while he's pastoring a church. And they had 14 churches. He comes here to get a job. He gets a job, he starts a church, one thing leads to another. He's leading the Foursquare Church, and he takes the denomination in England from 16 churches to 46. 46 churches in how many years? Six or 7 years. Somebody ought to be saying hallelujah. See, what I'm trying to say today is you guys are doing the right thing. Let's just do more of it. You're doing the right thing. Let's just do more of it. The book that I'm writing, that I've written, that's getting ready to be published, the main center story in the book is the church he came from in Sri Lanka. We're trying to teach, our thing at Exponential, we're talking to 10,000 American pastors a year. And we're trying to teach them, you figure out what they're doing in Sri Lanka and you copy that, and America will be a better place. And by the way, in that book I wrote about you guys. So here's what one denomination told me. I talked to a denominational official and he said that their plan is they invest $350,000 US in every single church that they plant. $350,000 US. The first church I planted, my wife and I had saved $2,000. We put our whole $2,000 in the church, and we got to the point where we paid the bills the last day. We had no more money. I was laying on the bed crying. Had some people coming to my house for a meeting, and I was crying, and I was so fearful I was going to have to call my dad and go, can I move home? And see, remember I told you, God wanted me to be born in California, and there was a mistake made. I'm living in California, and now I'm going to have to go back home to Oregon where it rains all the time and live in my father's basement with my wife and 2 children and get a job selling used cars, because that's all I knew how to do, because I went to a Bible college. I didn't get trained to be an architect. I went to a Bible college. All I knew how to do is sell stuff. And so in despair, I'm crying out, God, what am I going to do? And the Lord spoke to me and said, I taught you to be poor. I'm going to teach you how to have enough. And 3 days later, miracles happened. Checks, money came from 3 different sources we didn't anticipate. And from then I got a regular paycheck. That was a miracle. But nobody gave me $350,000. They gave me 0. Well, actually, they didn't. They gave me $150 a month for 4 months. They gave me $600 to start a church. And they probably gave you less. But here you are. We don't need $350,000. Here's what the guy told me in the $350,000 conversation. He said, at the end of the 3 years, a lot of times our pastors just pack up and move out of town. They spent the whole thing and nothing happened. The church never really got going, and they just leave, and we're wasting so much money. He was almost on tears when he was telling me this. And then I have another friend, and this guy is a little more successful. He's a real smart guy, and they don't spend as much money. They spend $125,000 to start a church. And so I met with him, and the whole reason that I met with this group was to try to figure out how to cut the costs. And so I started saying these things, and some of the people got excited, and the other people hated me. And then he said this. He said, we started 46 churches, and all 46 survived. We didn't have anybody take the money and then leave town. They all survived. And he goes, our largest church has 600 people in it. We're really proud of that. He goes, but most of our churches have 40 people. For $125,000, you could bribe 40 people to come to church. I mean, $145,000. That's you take $40,000 times 3. So you just say, here's $3,000. Come to my church. I'll give you $3,000, and you got 40 people in church. $3,000. You could go $1,000 a year. I'll give you $800 a month to come to my church. That would equal what they're doing. It's silly. It's silly. The Christians in the New Testament had nothing. They were persecuted. One of my favorite passages of Scripture is in Acts, the 14th chapter. Paul goes to Derbe and Lystra, and he gets stoned to death in Lystra. They think they killed him. They leave. The Bible says that the believers gathered around him. It doesn't say they prayed, but they must have. And he comes back to life. He sneaks back into the city, and then they go back to the other cities where they'd been. And watch this. It says, he appointed elders from among the disciples in every city. Well, what's that mean? These were young Christians who they'd been discipling, but they hadn't organized churches. And then Paul goes and says, you're the leader here, you're the leader here, you're the leader here, and you're the leader there. And he leaves. And nobody had a church building. They couldn't have. Nobody had a salary. They couldn't have. Nobody had any of the stuff that we think that we need to have church. They couldn't have. They had the Holy Spirit. And nobody even had cell phones or email. If Paul wanted to write him a letter, they say it would take 6 months for the letter to get there and 6 months for them to send the letter back. So what did they have? They had the Bible and they had the Holy Spirit and they had each other. And I think that's enough. So what am I saying? I'm saying that you folks came here thinking you're poor. I hope you go home realizing you're rich. And that you can do great and mighty things in the name of the Lord. That the future is way better than the past.